Thank you very much. I hope that standing up helped you wake up and be ready for some intense activities here. Let me organize myself for a moment. Friends, it's a distinct pleasure to be here with you. And I feel like I should thank you for making the effort to come. Although outside of any official message that I could give you, as I used to in the past in such meetings, I'm surprised at the amount of people that show up at such meetings. You know, I used to be able to get on the platform, and this is a little close to me here. Get on the platform and rouse the masses and try to get everybody to be more active and all those kind of things. But situated now in California in a comfortable hammock, I find it very difficult to call you to action. So I've taken another tack now, and that is call people to reflection, which helps me too, because I speak to myself and I have to study the writings and think about the things that we could consider, that beyond our obligation to be active and supportive of all of the various functions of the faith, can enrich our motivation. If anything, we need, from time to time, like once or twice a day, every day, draw inspiration from the writings in such a way that we don't get tired in the service of the faith, that it provide for us a constant fountain of renewal. And when the committee kindly invited me to this conference, I suggested this subject of immortality in the human spirit. It's a very large and diversified subject. Certainly we won't be able to cover all aspects of it in a weekend, but it's good that we begin, if you will, a renewed consideration of the various dimensions of eternal life, as we will discuss both in this life and in the next life. One of the essential points here is Abdu'l-Baha says that if you don't get it here, you won't get it there. In other words, we have to transform ourselves here to have the full reward of the condition of eternal life in the realms beyond when we move on. We will also consider a few quotations about the fact that those who haven't heard of the faith are not responsible and will have an opportunity to recognize the cause and recognize Baha'u'llah when they go to enter the next world. Those who are responsible for them not knowing, that's another matter. Shoghi Effendi said we should be busy telling people, especially at this early stage of the cause. We always talk about how great it is and how big it is, but when you consider how few we are against the numbers and the masses and the multitudes of humanity, we're really still in a very privileged position, a privileged position which requires us to reflect very deeply about what we can do for the cause and what the cause has done for us when we think about it, when we ask ourselves what kind of lives would we have if we hadn't discovered the truths of the faith, if we hadn't seen the action of these truths in guiding us, in nurturing us, in developing us a consciousness that we don't see prevailing in the world today, something quite different, and which is the means of our attracting others to the cause and to its role. One of the motives that I had in choosing this topic comes from a conversation that Abdu'l-Baha had with one of the early believers. This believer, a woman, asked Abdu'l-Baha, how can I teach the Baha'i faith? more effectively. And Abdu'l-Baha said that in order to teach the faith effectively, you need to live the life. Of course, that's a big subject in itself, but generally it means working all the time to try to conform our outlook, our actions, our words, our deeds, our inner thoughts to the teachings that Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha have brought us. And this is quoted in Star of the West, by the way. He says, the first thing to do is to acquire thirst for spirituality. Then live the life, live the life, live the life. The way to acquire this thirst is to meditate upon the future life. Study the holy words, read your Bible, read the holy books, especially study the holy utterances of Baha'u'llah. Prayer and meditation, take much time for these two. Then will you know this great thirst, and then only can you begin to live the life. So, turning our thoughts to this future life, turning our thoughts to the teachings that we have in this day on the question of immortality and the realms beyond, ignites in us that fire and that thirst, if you will, which enables us to be more conscientious in living the life, and that living the life acts like a magnet that draws people to us and helps confirm them in the truth of the faith. We become the letters of the book, so to speak. The book is the great attractor, and we are the individual letters of that book if we conform to its rhythms and to its inspiration and to its forces and energies. That makes us think, well, we have to survey the whole question of eternal life. And we find that initially we need to think about the purpose of existence. That in the writings, Baha'u'llah affirms, as I'm sure you're all aware, that we have been created by God to know and to love Him, to know and worship Him. And he also states very clearly that we've been created, the motive of God in creating us is love. That He loved us so much that He created the human race, has endowed us with the capacity to reflect that love. And that love reflected in the human spirit, in our human soul, in our minds and thoughts, is a source of great motivation for us, great attraction, confirmation, enabling us to discover the purpose and mystery of life. The Baha'i teachings really, more than any other scriptures of the past, reveal great areas, realms of understanding connected to eternal life and what its purpose is. It's amazing when you start reviewing it. We have, first of all, explanations about the nature of the human soul, what that might be, what its origin is, what its purpose is, where it's going, what the stages of its development are. Then we have a whole realm of teachings for the first time, really, in the history of religion about the nature of the manifestation of God, to the degree that we're able to reflect and think about that. We have testimonies from the manifestation of God on His receipt of the divine message that He was called and raised up to deliver. We never had such an insight in the past. Then we have something about the action of the spirit of faith, one of those degrees of spirit that he describes in his writings, and the effect that has on human realities. Beyond that, we come to the explanations about the character of death and the nature of the hereafter. We will see also that there are certain things we can do to prepare for eternal life, to strengthen us in it. And finally, we come to quotations and passages and answers in the writings about the conditions and activities of the soul in the world to come, something that we've had very little knowledge of or intimation of in the writings of the holy books of the past. And some of the things that were in the holy books of the past have led to misunderstandings and belief in reincarnation and other misunderstood doctrines. And finally, what kind of supportive action, what might be the role of those of us that remain here for our loved ones and dear ones who have already passed on? For the first time, we have quite a bit of knowledge of what assists them in their development in the other world, and a whole array of sublime prayers and meditations to support our loving hopes and desires for them. We'll come to that towards the end of the set of quotations and different things we'll consider here. Along with the question of knowing and loving God, right parallel with it are a number of passages related to the presence of God, attaining the presence of God, and that this is the ultimate goal of human reality. And from what I understand, this may be a good moment to interject this, from what I understand, not necessarily what the teachings state, although I try to follow the teachings, but we don't always get it right. You know, I'm a limited human being. You may say, oh, he's come from that exalted place. Surely he can deliver a clear, exact message, but it doesn't work out that way. You have to compare everything I say against the writings and the texts of the faith. And I hope that my being here will become a provocation for that, for you to go and check it out. And when you hear something that I say that doesn't seem to match up with the teachings as you understand them, you could tell me about it. I prefer you don't announce it in the meeting here, but you could tell me privately, and I'll investigate to see how I can correct my understanding. We're all in the same position in this. So what we're really doing is, if you will, creating an itch, creating a desire to go back and look at these writings, to study them, to think about them, and then to consider how we will put them into action. If I can achieve that end in the gathering, I will be happy. I was telling somebody else, they said, oh, Mr. Dunbar. I said, no, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Dunbar stayed in the Holy Land. I'm just Hooper now. Especially in California, where everything is first name. It probably is the same way here in Texas. I don't know. We've been gone from the States, my wife and I, for 50 years, between the pioneering and the period in the Holy Land. And the transfer back, it's not a pioneer post, and yet it is a pioneer post. We're coming home, and yet we're not coming home. Our home is there. Our heart is in the Holy Land. But we come back, and every foreign land, there's a quotation from Shoghi Effendi, says, every foreign land is a fatherland. And we come back, and we're consoled by the spirit that we see animating the believers everywhere in this vast country. We've had an opportunity to visit a little in the West Coast and in the South and in Washington and in Chicago and so on. And everywhere we see illumined faces, bright with the hope of the cause, alive with the vision that the House of Justice is creating in us. They're the pioneers of this new vision, if you will, of this new culture of the cause, and attracting us to a clearer understanding of community and united efforts to raise up the cause of God. And we want to reflect on all of that, because the motivation of the question of immortality and all is to assist us to collaborate in these affairs and activities that the House of Justice is calling to, and which ultimately is the place of safety for us. Some of the Baha'is, long-standing, have been used to other patterns. Some of the community patterns are changing. The emphasis is shifting. But very important for us to realize that that flow of clear, current, fresh energy that comes from the messages of the House of Justice is where we need to be going, and gradually replace any older thoughts and approaches and pet favorite activities to the ones that we're being called upon to perform today. The purpose of existence, the presence of God being the presence of the manifestation of God, affirmed over and over. I'm going to ask for a few quotations to be read to you from the writings. Holly Hansen is here from Massachusetts. Holly has collaborated with me in the writing of the book on the forces of our time. And she's going to read a few quotations that we've selected with respect to this to start off.
I'm going to read a few quotations about what?
About the purpose of existence, the presence of God, the ones you had there at the beginning.
All right, great.
We've had about 30 seconds to prepare this part of the program, so
let's start with the purpose of existence.
I wonder if that's on. Is that on?
Is it on? Is it on? No. I can still hear you. Okay. You know, I'm a university professor, and this is not a big crowd. Can you hear me in the back? The purpose of existence. The purpose of God in creating man has been and will ever be to enable him to know his Creator and to attain his presence. Baha'u'llah. Having created the world and all that liveth and moveth therein, he, through the direct operation of his unconstrained and sovereign will, chose to confer upon man the unique distinction and capacity to know him and to love him, a capacity that must needs be regarded as the generating impulse and the primary purpose of the whole, underlying the whole of creation. Those are both Baha'u'llah. This is Abdul Baha, and a little less familiar to us. The end of every material work is without result, because it is perishable and inconstant. Okay. It's not on? Okay. Is this what you want?
Mm-hmm. What better?
All right. Is it on? Yes? The end of every material work is without result, because it is perishable and inconstant. But the first real work is attraction to the fragrance of God, enkindlement with the fire of the love of God, reading the verse of unity, and beholding the lights from the dawning place of history. After that cometh the training of the soul, purification of character, and service to humanity. If thou art able to accomplish any one of these, the result is eternal and the fruit everlasting.
Thank you.
How do I turn this off? Are you turning it off? Okay, cool.
Thank you. So God's purpose, we're told, has ever been and will ever be to enable us to know our Creator and to attain His presence. Now, you're all aware of the Baha'i teachings that the essence of God, the inner reality of God, the central orb of the universe, so to speak, is incomprehensible because of the vastness of the character of, and we can't even discuss what that is, it's completely unknowable. It surrounds us, and we are the surrounded and not the surrounding. If we could surround him and understand him, then he would no longer be God, and I don't know what we would be. Foolish, I think, probably. But in any case, we understand that this great unknowable essence, or our Creator, out of his love for us has brought into being manifestations of God, what are called in the Baha'i writings the manifestations of God, that manifest the divine names and attributes, that reflect, if you will, in a manner commensurate with our capacity to receive and accept them, the rays of that central orb of the universe. We believe that God is not an unconscious force. He's a personal God. He has awareness of us. He's constant reality that's present. But he transcends any attempt on the part of our limited individuality to understand him. In fact, if we could understand him in any way, Baha'u'llah says we would be totally overwhelmed and annihilated, because that's a power that's sustaining what we now know through the modern developments, an endless universe that goes out there in every direction, that has existed for billions of years, that is full of galaxies and planets to a number that no one can calculate. I mean, they quite admit now they don't have numbers to deal with these things. I remember a few weeks ago we saw a three-dimension IMAX performance about the Hubble's developments. If you have a chance to see that, I suggest you go see it. It completely opens your mind to a whole new type of existence. The end of the universe, where they go with their cameras, is only the beginning of something else that also is endless. So we realize that such a creator that has within his orbit and realm not only these visible worlds, but invisible worlds, is something quite beyond our limited capacity. So he creates a reflection of himself and progressively reveals this reflection into the world of humanity and nurtures and develops us stage by stage until we become aware of his presence. And at first, we may think we're focused on Baha'u'llah, yes, but Shoghi Effendi tells us that it's not his person, his outer reality, which he needs in order to come into the world to exist with us, to convey his message, but the light that shines from him or through him from the Creator. One time in Chile several years ago, when we were looking for temple land down there, the lady who was dealing with the Baha'i public relations said to me that she liked the Baha'i writings, the Baha'i teachings, but she didn't understand this thing, how we could worship another human being. And could I please explain that? Well, I took a deep breath and I said, you know, there's different orders of beings. Some of them seem to be the same, but when you look carefully there, or not even too carefully, you see there's quite a difference. For instance, in our present circumstances, we live on the planet Earth, and there are other orbs around us, but there's a central orb, and that central orb is the sun. It's also a body, like these other bodies, but not at all the same. All the life of all these planets depends on that power of that central sun. And Abdu'l-Baha, in his explanations, and surely in the tablets of Baha'u'llah, we see that this sun of truth is considered a reality that's symbolized in the outer world by the activities of the physical sun. Through its light and through its warmth, all things exist. So our inner spiritual nature requires that light and that warmth in order for it to develop and to become aware of its maker. Well, I don't know what the dear lady did after that. She seemed to be satisfied at the moment with that explanation. But I think it's something we need to realize, that the manifestation, yes, he has an outer physical existence, but it's far superior. I think when we think of it in terms of Jesus or Moses or Muhammad, we realize they were historical figures, but they far transcended that in the role that they played in the release of divine energies, inspiration, which then sustains millions of people for thousands of years. It's not as if we could be confused about who the messengers of God are if we look through human history. We see philosophers, Plato and Aristotle and so on, they have an influence, but they don't have a following, they don't have a community, they don't have a civilization that comes in the wake of those teachings. Now we're at the very early stages, the formative age of the Baha'i teachings, so we don't see those realities coming out yet. To some degree, we feel them in our own beings. Those of us that have lived as long as I have, and I'm sure there's some of you in the room, can see the changes that have taken place over half a century. Great transformations are, I mean, quite unprecedented if you look at past history. Up until the coming of the Bab, from the time of Christ until the coming of the Bab, the speed that you could go anywhere was the speed of a horse. That was it. You couldn't go any faster. But think what's happened since the coming of the Bab. How we've all been transformed in our possibilities. How the oneness of mankind proclaimed in Baha'u'llah's central teachings, and what Abdu'l-Baha calls the first principle of the Baha'i faith, that we are all the leaves of one tree and the fruits of one branch. How that's coming into human consciousness. How it's coming into human consciousness through ways that we never could have imagined at the beginning. For example, how technology has linked together some of us older people, but mostly the youth all over the world, in the internet and now in Facebook and other realities, created for other purposes, but they get bent gradually to the divine purpose because they infuse people with an understanding, just as maybe the Olympic Games does, that we're all one people, we all have the same aspirations, we're all one race. Television has also given us an immediate access to events around the world which confirm us in an understanding of that oneness. And through these developments, we can begin to perceive the long-term effects of Baha'u'llah's coming, how these energies convert themselves into new sciences and new arts. And by the way, in the original writings, arts and sciences have a little different meaning from what we understand by arts in modern English. Science is the knowledge base of realities that's perceived and registered and measured. And arts are the applications of those realities to the service of humanity. So within the context of the Baha'i writings, dentistry is an art. Agriculture is an art. It develops in products, in services, the sciences that are growing through experimentation and observation on the other hand. So Baha'u'llah says we should familiarize ourselves with all arts and sciences. It's a big range of things. I don't mean to say that eliminates the fine arts, because they're also referred to, but it's a subset of arts in general. And of course, we know different passages in the writings about music and crafts and skills of various sorts. So coming back to these quotations, and we're going to speak in the next hour a bit about these powers of the manifestation, all-encompassing powers of the manifestation of God, as explained in the writings. Coming back to here, we say that through the direct operation of his will, he chose to confer upon man the unique distinction and capacity to know him and to love him. If you look at the order of creation, mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom. None of those kingdoms, the beings in those kingdoms, have awareness of their creator the way and of the use of the mind, the rational capacity that man has. It makes him quite distinct. And it then endows him with a capacity to choose good or choose evil. He has a free will. And that places us in a very grave responsibility with regard to the writings, because we don't just automatically become good. We have to make choices, and those choices have to conform to the divine writings. That's a major challenge in our lives in any case, I think, because it's so easy and natural to accept that life is the way it presents itself around us. But if we compare the content of the divine writings with the motives and actions and willfulness of the society around us, we realize this is nothing very similar at all. And that we have a great obligation, because of having the honor of having recognized the faith, of replacing old concepts and worldviews and ideas that we've inherited from our families, from our communities, from the society around us, from the media blast that we receive all the time that tells us what the meaning of life is or isn't. We have to replace that with these divine teachings. And as we do that, it's as if out of a murk we create a crystal. Each of the writings are like salts going into the mixture, and gradually this crystal appears within our being, which has a solidity and a nature identical, or, if you will, fostered by the divine vision that's given us in the writings. And that light, then the light of God begins to refract and reflect off of that crystal. And to make the long view short, Baha'u'llah says we will come to see with the eye of God and hear with his ear. This is closely connected to the question of acquiring the spirit of faith. Do we have the spirit of faith? Do we see with the eye of God? Do we hear with his ear? I think we all have the challenge in our own lives to think, how can we move to that? And then to see how important that is with relation to what's going to happen after we shake off the mortal coil, so to speak, after we leave our bodies behind and we move on. What opportunities will we have there? The world that we see around us, Abdu'l-Baha says, is a world of darkness, because the world is walking, having abandoned the knowledge of God, having turned to other forms of worship, if you will, having occupied themselves with any number of distractions. You could probably make a list longer than I could, but I noticed, for instance, and there's nothing wrong inherently in these things, except when they occupy central stage in the lives of individuals. Computer games, sports activities, entertainments of all sorts, distractions, things that keep us from taking a little time each day to think about who we are and how we're moving along, to bring ourselves to account, as Baha'u'llah suggests, at the end of each day, to measure our actions and our motivations, if you will, against what we read in the Holy Writings, to ask God's forgiveness if we find we've fallen short in the performance of our duties, and also to praise him when we see that in the course of the day we've managed to do something that might be pleasing to him. The Bab says, weigh your actions this way, in these two categories. And if you see you've done something good, then ask God's assistance and blessing to be able to repeat and develop that. And if you have something that isn't acceptable and you've slipped and fallen in some way, ask his forgiveness and ask him for strength to move on. This is simple formula that he gives us, and Baha'u'llah tells us, calls us to account each day, to call ourselves to account each day, keeps our sights, if you will, on the goal. The last quotation that Holly read for us talks about the first work, the first real work being attraction to the fragrance of God, enkindlement with the fire of the love of God, reading the verses of unity, beholding the lights from the dawning place of mystery, in other words, from the manifestation of God. After that cometh the training of the soul, perfection of character, and service to humanity. The one is motivated by the other. In other words, the degree to which we are enkindled and attracted and confirmed in prayer and in meditation, to that degree will be effective in the actions we take in service to humanity. And over and over in the writings, we see the reference to the interaction of these two. When you examine Shoghi Effendi's writings and write back into the Master, and also Baha'u'llah, you see that the question of study of the faith is intimately connected with teaching of the faith. He talks about how a little knowledge is dangerous in the teaching work. We need to inform ourselves. Part of the purpose of the study circles and the present Ruhi curriculum that's there is to give Baha'is a broader base from which to operate, so that they will feel sufficiently informed about the nature of the faith that they can spontaneously speak about it and not be suddenly frozen on the spot with the question all of us want but nobody cares to answer. What is the Baha'i faith anyway? Or what is this Baha'i thing you're following? And we're all, I'm sure every time that question comes up, we feel challenged. How do we answer this? What do we say? Well, I think being around a while, you say the greatest name in your heart and you say, hey, help me to say whatever this person needs to hear, because otherwise I'm going to pass on some idea of my own here that's not going to do the job. And they're willing to listen maybe for 1 minute. How do you put the whole Baha'i faith into 1 minute? That's another question you want to meditate on as you prepare for service and action. These are high callings, and if you take a minute to examine the content of your thoughts in the course of a day, how much of it pertains to this question of enkindlement with the fire of love of God, the fragrance of God's teachings, reading the verses of unity, beholding the lights flowing from the manifestation? Is it something we do sometimes at the adult class on Sunday morning? Do we come to it? Do we say our obligatory prayer? Do we say, well, I'm a very busy person, so I say the short prayer, and after you've said it, you can't remember whether you said it or not later in the day? I mean, are we sufficiently familiar with the long obligatory prayer that we don't have to stand on our head and read the book at the same time? Have we incorporated some of these divine verses into our thought patterns? Interrupt with a little story of Helen Bishop. Helen Bishop wrote the preface in the early days, the introduction to the first edition of the Kitab-i-Ghan that Shoghi Effendi translated with his encouragement. She was a very gifted lady. She was dealing with traveling and teaching in universities all over the world. And she went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She tells this story on herself. She says, and I thought, well, I'm going to be in the presence of the guardian. I've got to think up some very good questions to ask the guardian. So she made a list in her mind of questions that she felt would sufficiently impress the guardian with her own knowledge and vision of the cause, you know. Wrong motivation, she discovered later on. Anyway, she went to the Holy Land, and there she was, and Shoghi Effendi welcomed her very warmly and placed her at his side, and the other pilgrims sat. And then he began speaking to the friends, and she said, I was distinctly aware he was ignoring me. He never looked at me. He smiled at everybody. He spoke to everybody. He never looked at me. And this went on for about a half an hour. And she said, you know, gradually, I thought to myself, something's wrong here. What's wrong? And she worked her way back to her questions that I came prepared to what I was going to do rather than coming open to see what he would tell me. And at that moment, she said, Shoghi Effendi turned to me and he smiled and he said, you must have some questions. I'm sure, Mrs. Bishop, you have some questions, some deep questions. And she said, I couldn't think of a single one. Well, she said, I gathered myself together and I thought, what's the most important thing that I want to know? And she said, it's, how can I teach better? How can I teach the cause more effectively? So she asked that. And she said, Shoghi Effendi, I mean, I could have imagined the things he could have said, but I never could have imagined what he did say. He turned to me and he said, Mrs. Bishop, you should memorize the hidden words. Now, this is a lady that had, you know, vast knowledge of the teachings of the faith, and I'm sure she knew the gleanings backwards and forward, and the Agon, and all the other things that she's done, but she hadn't thought of that. And she said, you know, it startled me, but I went away and I memorized at least the English ones of the Arabic hidden words. I memorized the English ones. She said, I never got the whole thing, all the Persian, but I did the English ones. And she said, it made such a difference because these divine thoughts would come into the phrasing of the way I stated things in my talks, and they would come into my mind at different moments and inspire me. I could, in the life's activities and the various situations that you encounter, you see the application of these holy words. And really, Shoghi Effendi wasn't saying anything new. The Master had called upon the Baha'is to memorize the hidden words also. And he said something more startling. He said, if you are assisted, and this is the question of if we have names and attributes of God, if we attract names and attributes of God, it's because God assists us in that. We ask him, we beg of him. If he confirms us, then we reflect those things. And where did I lost my thought here? The application of the hidden words in her life, then she found, was consistent across the board, and it would enable her, would inspire her in different ways. So the Master, having said we should do this, oh, I know, I've got back on track now. The Master said, if you are assisted to live one of these hidden words, you will have lived all of them. So we can, from that we can understand that they're entirely interactive and reflective, the one hidden word of another. So whichever one attracts you and appeals to you, beg God to assist you to live that, to make that part of your life, and then the whole rest of the gamut of the inspiration of the hidden words will come into play in your lives. Obviously, this question of, you know, how much do we think about the writings? How much time do we take to study them? How is it that we drift away from this attraction to the faith that we've all felt at some time, or we wouldn't be Baha'is, and we wouldn't be in this room? How is it that it's sometimes lessens? Some of you, maybe you'll recall, Bill Sears used to say this in the meetings. He says, if you don't feel as close to God as you used to, who moved? This is the whole thing. It's we're the ones, you know, that are carrying the balance here, and we have to apply ourselves as best we can. I read the other day I was a bit startled when I saw it, a copy of a letter of Shoghi Effendi to an individual, sending regards to this individual and saying that whatever else they did in their lives, he hoped they would find a couple hours a day to study the holy teachings. A couple hours a day. That's kind of like starters, you know, whatever else you're doing, set aside a couple hours for studying the writings. How many of us have done that in our lives? How many of you have in your past, studied some subject at university or even before that, where you studied every day for 1 hour that subject. For example, the very useful subject, history of Texas. I don't mean to knock history of Texas, that's important. But when you compare that to the content of what the revelation of the messages of the divine revelators and the implications that it has in our lives and the repercussion it can have on the ordering and peaceful coexistence of mankind, there's no comparison. Don't stop studying the history of Texas, but do take up some study of Baha'i history and try to, as the best you can, absorb that, make it your own. All of the writings of the faith at the beginning, sometimes I know I found as a new Baha'i, I could read the Master with much greater ease than I could read Baha'u'llah. It seemed to me Baha'u'llah was saying the same thing over and over. Of course, he is saying the same thing over and over. We just don't know what he's saying. But as we begin to get some idea from reading the Master, he leads us into it, and we begin to see the power and beauty then of Baha'u'llah's teachings. There's a book, the Prayers and Meditations revealed by Baha'u'llah, that I think is a great neglected text, if you will, because we think of it as we read it, we open it, it's a big book, it's hard to become familiar with, we don't find our way around easily at the beginning. And we open up and we find some prayer and it says, "Thou beholdest me shut up in my prison house." And that's not for me, and we go to another prayer. Now, Shoghi Effendi has taken his good time to translate all these meditations so that we could understand something about the nature and sufferings of the manifestation of God. So sometime take up that book and just mark which ones are the ones that seem to be in Baha'u'llah's personal voice, appealing to God or lamenting his condition or whatever it is, and study those apart. Make it a book of study as well as a book of prayer. An infinite source of things. We've got the gleanings, where Shoghi Effendi has selected key passages from the whole range of Baha'u'llah's writings and offered them to us. We have the Kitab-i-Gan, the Book of Certitude, which is this all-time doctrinal great work that links the whole history of the redemptive scheme of God through the past dispensations, through past prophets, up to the present day, and shows us the keys and offers us even the content of what should be the spirit of a true seeker so that he can acquire the fire of the love of God and behold the lights shining from the words of God. How we can develop a thirst for spirituality that the Master mentions here in this early quotation, so that we can live the life. How can we focus our attention sufficiently during each day that this will become a growing process in us and will be the source of comfort, of guidance, of exhilaration in our lives, and will enable us then to touch others with the truths and the beauty and the fragrance of the writings, if you will. If you accomplish any one of these, he says, the result is eternal and the fruit everlasting. It's a little bit like the hidden words. If you do one of them, you're going to get all of them. If you take the time to focus on any one of these aspects that we're talking about, then we're promised that will be something that will give you an eternal outcome. Now, the nature of the soul is a very interesting dimension of this. I think I'll ask Holly if she'll read a few quotations for us again, put us in remembrance of these amazing words of Baha'u'llah concerning the nature of the human soul.
Do you want the ones about the spirit, or do you want the nature of the soul?
Those, okay. Good. Those three.
Thou hast asked me, concerning the nature of the soul. Know verily that the soul is a sign of God, a heavenly gem whose reality the most learned of men hath failed to grasp, and whose mystery no mind, however acute, can hope to unravel. It is the first among all created things to declare the excellence of its creator, the first to recognize his glory, to cleave to his truth, and to bow down in adoration before him. If it be faithful to God, it will reflect his light and will eventually return unto him. If it fail, however, in its allegiance to its creator, it will become a victim of self and passion and will, in the end, sink in their depths. Baha'u'llah. Again, Baha'u'llah. These energies with which the day star of divine beauty and source of heavenly guidance hath endowed the reality of man lie, however, latent within him, even as the flame is hidden within the candle, and the rays of light are potentially present in the lamp. The radiance of these energies may be obscured by worldly desires, even as the light of the sun can be concealed beneath the dust and dross which cover the mirror. One more?
That's good. The next one on the top of the next page.
Okay. Again, Baha'u'llah. Verily I say, the human soul is in its essence one of the signs of God, a mystery among his mysteries. It is one of the mighty signs of the Almighty, the harbinger that proclaimeth the reality of all the worlds of God. Within it lieth concealed that which the world is now utterly incapable of apprehending. I'm going to read that sentence again.
Good.
Within it lieth concealed that which the world is now utterly incapable of apprehending. Ponder in thine heart the revelation of the soul of God, that pervadeth all his laws, and contrast it with that base and appetite of nature that hath rebelled against him, that forbiddeth men to turn unto the Lord of names, and impelleth them to walk after their lusts and wickedness. Such a soul hath, in truth, wandered far in the path of error.
It is of the common view that the essential human being is the body, is the material body. In the world around us, this is considered what's the primary thing. The soul, well, the spirit, well, we don't know what that is, but we know what the body is. We can pinch it, and we can feel it, and we know what it is. And yet the writings tell us that the soul is the animating force of the body. In a mysterious switch of terms, Abdu'l-Baha even says it's the substance of the body, because it's the spiritual single element, that reality that exists within us, which gives and maintains our continuity through all of the realms of God. It acquires a body, it comes into being at conception, he tells us, and then it grows and develops through various stages until the body is no longer needed. It's the body, we're told, is like a lamp, and it has the life in it is like the oil in the lamp. There's a certain amount of oil in each of our lamps, and when that burns out, that's the end of it. That we no longer need that lamp. We transcend to another realm of consciousness. So we want to of course, there is the question of accidental death, of something interfering with the light, either through our own actions or through some other actions, but we have to believe that these things also are within the compass of the will of God. He's created all of it. And each of those events has meaning. In any case, what appears to be loss from our point of view may be gain for the soul if it goes to the other world. Sometimes young plants are transferred at an early stage. We have to provide a space in our own understanding that children who are aborted continue to exist. They've come into their individuality at the stage of the womb, and they go to the next world. And the Master says, you will meet your loved ones, the ones, your lost creatures, you will meet them in the next world, developed and full of life. We'll come talk about that a little bit later on also. So we've got this body, which Abdu'l-Baha likens in one place to a horse, and our soul to the rider on the horse. Now, if the horse is untrained, it takes the rider wherever it wants. It's completely willful in its own, and the rider doesn't know what to do to control the horse. The teachings of God give us the means of training the horse of the human lower self, bringing it under control. If we bring it under control, the horse is a terrific mount, and it can take us up high places. We can achieve things with it that we couldn't achieve without it. Part of the wisdom of the life that we're in. Our interactions, our struggles with our two natures is what endows us eventually with distinction. And this is something that we see over and over in the writings, how we have to try to discipline ourselves, how we have to change our ways, how we have to learn to lean on the power of the manifestation, on the power of God, to overcome the faults and weaknesses that we have. We all have them. I think you can testify to that. There's a verse of Abdu'l-Baha, he says, this is not a world of perfections. And all of us are a clear demonstration of that truth. In a sense, you know, we can all find things in ourselves that we don't like. We probably can find things in ourselves that we find very, very reprehensible. Maybe so reprehensible that we start playing God to ourselves, and we say to ourselves, if I were God, I wouldn't forgive this thing that I did. And we paralyze ourselves in our growth, in our spiritual growth. Now, that's not what the teachings tell us. The teachings tell us, if you fall down, get up. If you commit an error or enter into some activity or some action that's inappropriate, pull back and ask the forgiveness of God. Now, do you remember the names of God related to this? This is good to think about it. Ever forgiving, all forgiving. I think we'd be hard-pressed to come up with some action we could commit which God couldn't forgive. I mean, he was ready to forgive Mirza Yahya, who wanted to snuff out the manifestation of God himself at his very essence. He offers him that forgiveness in the book of Akdas. So we shouldn't play God with ourselves. We should let God play God. We should let him forgive us. We should let him raise us up each time we have a failing. We should turn, he says, consume every wayward thought with the flame of his loving mention. This is one of these phrases that's in the passage about the true seeker in the Kitab-i-Gan. Consume every wayward thought with the flame of his loving mention. Well, the mention of God is the remembrance of God. Maybe most effectively would just be the greatest name, Allah Abha. You find your thoughts are, because as we have human bodies, we get desires and we get attractions that are inappropriate. We have to just stop them with some divine thought, with some verse or something. Save ourselves a whole lot of trouble. We get an attraction. Instead of getting the attraction and leaving it alone, we play with it. Our imagination dresses it up or undresses it, whatever the case may be, and gets us into trouble. Just the imagination. How do we avoid that? How do we recognize that there are impulses that come from our lower nature that we need to just stem at each instance? And I think the more we enter into a life of prayer, I think we can be assured that Baha'u'llah, if he's given us a formula for our spiritual life, he's told us about obligatory prayers, he's told us about the fast, the recitation of verses morning and evening, bringing ourselves to account each day. Someone wrote The Guardian and said, didn't he think we needed some more advanced form of meditation? And he said, you know, if Baha'u'llah had considered that essential, he surely would have given us the supreme manifestation of God, knowledge of everything that you could think of. He didn't tell us to meditate on our navels. He didn't tell us, you know, to put ourselves in some strange position to become spiritual. It doesn't mean that such practices in the realm of physical education may not be helpful. I know a lot of people are doing yoga exercises, and I know some of the exalted ones in the World Center did them too, so that's not to chide yourself on that account. But what he gives us is the essence of what we have to what we have to perform during the day. The obligatory prayer, all right, we don't want to ever lapse, or if we have lapsed, we want to get back on a regular, steady basis of using the prayers and fulfilling the prayers. I used to tell the youth it's kind of like you don't want to do without lunch, you know, you do without eating. You say, well, I'm too busy, so I can't eat today. You do that for a few days and you lose all your strength and you have no push left. But somehow we think that, well, if I don't say the obligatory prayer every day, or I couldn't get to it tonight, or I'm too sleepy tonight that I forgot it during the day and I can't do it. Abdu'l-Baha says there's two legitimate excuses for failing to say the obligatory prayer: severe illness and insanity. So take your choice between those two. The fast is another thing. We don't want to lose out on the advantages of the fast. I saw one tablet when we were reviewing these quotations that have now been published in this little book about the fasting as obligatory prayer as being the two pillars of the spiritual life of the soul. And Baha'u'llah says he likens the fast to a dam. At first you think the fast and a dam, and then you realize that a dam holds the water. It collects water and holds it, and then you can let it out in measured quantities. So somehow those 19 days of devotion and obedience to the Creator fill that dam up and enable us then to use the benefits of it throughout the whole year. My idea. You see if it works in your life. I remember giving a talk in one of the countries that I visited about the fast. And a lady came up to me afterwards, just beaming. She said, oh, that was a wonderful talk. And she said, it's so interesting what you said about the fast. She said, but I personally can't fast because it makes me hungry. Okay, we want to get the body under control with all of its desires and passions and everything else, and we've got prayers. You know how many prayers are in the prayer book to help us in that job. We want to lean on the Master and on Baha'u'llah to assist us in that, because it's not an easy job. It requires, I think Shoghi Effendi's words in the Advent, daily vigilance in the watching of one's motives and pursuits of one's desires. It's all very subtle. I'm sure you've seen in yourself how subtle it can be. There's a line in the Akdas about not letting your good actions becoming snares for your desires. Sometimes we perform good actions, but we have another motive behind it. We have to watch all the time our motives to see that they're proper and that they are in accord with the divine good pleasure. Not fool ourselves. It's easy enough to do sometimes. We wake up suddenly having fallen down. And again, the principle is to get up and go forward. Mortal man is prone to err, and Baha'u'llah declares he's ignorant of the mysteries that lie unfolded within him. But he does say that the purpose of life is to attain to an understanding of those mysteries. If we have no concept of such mysteries, if we have no concept of the riches and treasures within the writings, we need to start bracing up and taking efforts to increase the flow of the inspiration of the divine writings. First of all, maybe with things that are more appealing to you, the passages that are appealing to you. I know Howard Colby Ives used to keep notebooks. We didn't have, in those early days, we didn't have computers, so you took down the writings on different subjects in a number of different notebooks, all with the title, you know, this one about the soul, that one about economic development, this one about quality of men and women, whatever it was. We wrote these things down, our favorite passages. It's still not a bad way to do things. It's very slow, but now you can find everything by going into the computer and pressing a button. But in the process, do you make it your own? Somehow the actual writing of some of these phrases, making little booklets, making little promptings for yourself, searching for quotations on some theme that is started to attract you, cross-reading through the books of writings of the Bab, the writings of Baha'u'llah, the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, and any explanations of Shoghi Effendi on some theme until the whole concept of it comes clear in your mind and begins to throb with a sense of truth. This then lets the energies that he says are latent in our soul, lets them start coming to life, and gives us great joy, and also gives us fresh resources for serving the interests of the plan we're involved in, for carrying out the divine plan. Abdu'l-Baha says a startling thing in the tablets of the divine plan. He says he wants us to become incarnate light. In another tablet, he says you should be reflecting divine light from the top of your head into your feet. What does that exactly mean? Sometimes in our lives we've met a Baha'i somewhere, or we've seen some of the hands of the cause. You see how radiant they became when they were serving the cause. And you realize you can see some example, some pattern of it in the world. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to behold, because it suggests to you a reality that maybe the reading of the text didn't open to you. We're told that one of the exciting activities of the soul in the next world, we'll come back to this later, is to witness the reality of every sanctified soul. There are moments, obviously, in this world where we're kind of fickle. We go up and we go down. I used to think that when I was a new Baha'i, I was either at the acme of faith and belief in the cause, or it didn't exist. And I'd go back and forth. There was a couple of years till I went pioneering that I was kind of like that, you know. I called it the yo-yo period, you know, just up and down and up and down. In the course of life, I've seen that it's possible for that yo-yo effect to go up at the same time that it's going up and down. And this is the thing you want to do, is draw. You may not always be in the same state of attraction. You beg, you say your prayers. Sometimes you say them in a routine manner because you don't feel anything, but you don't let off. You don't stop. And you ask for the assistance that comes with that. And the association with the loved ones of God, as we have in occasions like this in this conference, also a source of terrific inspiration, because you see the love flowing from the Baha'is. And it's an impersonal love that Abdu'l-Baha calls us to. You know, he says in his talks in America in particular, he says, I want the friends to love all humanity the way God loves all humanity. And that love is a reflection of the love we have for God and for Baha'u'llah. That's the source of the love we have for humanity. Not their good qualities or their bad qualities. My heavens, then it would stop us right down. You know, Abdu'l-Baha says we don't admire the shortcomings of other souls. But he says that this light that we have for love of humanity is like the light of the sun. The sun shines down, it shines on everything. It shines on the homes of the sinners and the homes of the blessed and the saints. It shines in the dry places, it shines in the meadows and the lakes and the mountains and everything. Shining all the time on everybody. Our love for humanity needs to be that kind of love, rather than a particular inspection to see whether this person is worthy of my love or not worthy of my love. And it's that kind of love that Abdu'l-Baha is part of living the life that we're talking about, that awakens an esteem in an individual who has no self-esteem, because he sees, you see something in him that he hasn't seen in himself, or she hasn't seen in herself. And you are lovingly addressing some aspect of their being which they were totally ignorant existed. And yet, by the way you speak to them, by the way you act to them, by the love that you show them, it awakens them to the fact that there is that reality that has to be developed, or that you actually see something in me that I didn't know existed, and it makes me happy. And then I want to be with you. And spiritual fellowship proceeds from that. How we have to nurture other souls and help them to realize what they have within themselves. Very important dimension. And part of the thing that then, through teaching the cause, through making these efforts to love others, we gain this dominance over our lower self. It's always sitting there waiting for us. Abdu'l-Baha says in one place, he said that the soul is like a bird on high, and the self, the lower self, the desires of the lower aspect of the soul, is like a hunter running along on the ground. And he's watching the bird, and he has a bow, he has arrows to shoot it down. And he's watching for one weakness on the part of the bird that he can shoot at. And every time, Abdu'l-Baha says, you have a lower human desire, your soul that's on high there flying, it produces an arrow in his quiver, which he's able to say, you want to be sure you don't have these desires as much as you can, because he's shooting at you, he's going to be shooting at you. And that can bring the soul down. And that's the nature of this human life. There's a lot of gamble, and we have to pray a lot for protection. We have to pray a lot for steadfastness. Why do we have this steadfastness? I'm a Baha'i. I always say I'm a Baha'i. What's the problem? It's steadfastness in the vision of human reality that's instilled in the teachings. That's another steadfastness. That's another constancy. Constancy that when the House of Justice says, get up and do this, that we don't say, oh, I don't know if that's the wisest thing here, you know. We don't do that here in, I don't want to say Texas again, but the sky is blue everywhere, so I imagine you've got some of that here too. Okay, soul and the body. Let's see now. The spirit of faith. Those of you who've been through children's classes or taught children's classes, you know how we used to we're always teaching the kingdoms. We have the mineral kingdom and the vegetable kingdom and the animal kingdom and the human kingdom. And then we have another kingdom, which is the kingdom of the spirit of faith. And then we have another one beyond that, which is called the Holy Spirit. Well, there's a number of tablets from Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah himself and Abdu'l-Baha that describe the stages of the soul. And sometimes they're very numerous ones, more elaborate than that scheme of 5 that we know from some answered questions. Spirit is a universal reality. Spirit is the animating breath, if you will, that comes from God, that is the source of the sustenance of creation. It's something it's a constant. It's not that God makes this and then he leaves it alone. He has to be sustaining us and creation at every moment. In fact, there's this mysterious doctrine about the recreation of creation at every instant that Baha'u'llah refers to in the Tablet of Wisdom. This occurs so quickly that we don't realize that it's constantly renewed. But the point of that, it seems to me, that the value of that is to realize there's an immediacy of God's sustaining your existence through the manifestation, through the ocean, if you will, of the manifestation's power and presence in existence. And this spirit of faith is the influence that comes from the words of God that creates this condition of faith in human consciousness, so that the lower mind of man, which is the rationality, which, by the way, when you think about the power of reason that we have, it serves our affections or our will. Whatever is what we're after, reason comes and backs it up. We say, no, but I'm a reasonable person. Why shouldn't I desire these things I desire? I see everybody else desires them, and nobody's dying from it. What's the problem, you know? We dialogue with our inner self. And we have to realize that the reason has to be suffused with the divine teachings. Then it becomes rational in the best sense. It's inspired. But if it's left to its own account, it can say, well, my life is so short, and I'll probably pay attention to religion after I get older, when I don't have any strength to do the things I want to do now. And, you know, kind of, I mean, you know, I'm young. Okay. Suddenly you're old, friends, you know how that is. It comes quick. And you're left with some bad memories of the days that your horse got away from you, so to speak. We want to see this spirit of faith become a constant in our life. He said, what is the spirit of faith? He says it is the breath of the Holy Spirit breathed in the soul of man. In other words, it's not a condition of agreement on your part that I'll have faith and I'll believe in this. Why not? Like you sometimes talking to people in the teachings, they said, yeah, that's good. In Spanish, it says, sure, this is good. ¿Por qué no? Why not? It's not enough. That's not the spirit of faith. Faith is a live flame, he says, which attracts the confirmations of the kingdom to your life. And I see some signals that it's time to stop for a little while and have a break. Thank you very much.